Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a world where a sneeze can change your destiny, where a bird landing on a rooftop might decide whether a king marches to war, and where a shadow moving the wrong way can make an entire village hold its breath. You're not just visiting the past tonight, you're walking through it, sandals crunching across dusty streets, while everyone around you carefully watches the sky, the animals, and sometimes even their own hiccups for signs of fate. Because thousands of years ago, the universe wasn't random. Not at all. It was constantly sending messages. And you were expected to read them. The only problem? You probably won't survive this, at least not socially, if you ignore the signs. Life in the ancient world runs on superstition the way modern life runs on Wi-Fi. Every decision, from planting crops to naming a baby, comes with a nervous glance toward omens. And if the omens look bad, well, suddenly that wedding might be postponed, that army might stay home, and that poor chicken might get consulted in ways it never signed up for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and the local time where you're listening from. It's always fascinating seeing how far these late-night history journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in an ancient marketplace, maybe somewhere in Mesopotamia around 4,000 years ago. Clay buildings glow under the sun. Traders shout prices. Goats wander with complete confidence that they own the place. And everyone, absolutely everyone, is paying attention to signs. A man beside you suddenly sneezes. Conversation stops. People glance at him the way modern people glance at someone who just dropped a glass in a quiet restaurant. In the ancient Near East, sneezing isn't just a body doing its thing. It might mean the gods are acknowledging something just said. In fact, ancient texts from Mesopotamia show that priests kept entire catalogs of omens. If a man sneezes once after speaking, it could confirm his statement. If he sneezes twice, well, that might mean the opposite. Historians still argue whether people truly believed every omen literally, or whether some were simply traditions everyone followed out of habit, like knocking on wood today. Either way, ignoring a sneeze omen would have felt about as reckless as ignoring a fire alarm. You start noticing other signs people watch for. A raven lands on a roof beam. That's not just a bird, that's information. Across many ancient cultures, birds were considered messengers between worlds. They fly between earth and sky, which to ancient minds meant they had direct access to the gods. In ancient Rome, official priests called augurs were tasked with studying bird behavior to predict the future. Yes, an entire government position existed for professional bird watching. Imagine telling your parents your career goal is interpreting pigeon vibes for the empire. Somehow, though, the Romans took it extremely seriously. If an augur reported unfavorable bird signs, a political assembly could literally be canceled. Wars have been delayed because a chicken refused to eat. I wish that were a joke, but it's completely real. Roman military leaders sometimes carried sacred chickens into battle. Before fighting, they'd scatter grain. If the chickens ate enthusiastically, the gods approved the battle plan. If the chickens refused, well, technically you were supposed to delay the fight. One Roman commander named Publius Claudius Pulcher famously ignored this rule during the First Punic War around 249 BCE. When the sacred chickens refused to eat, he reportedly threw them overboard and said, "If they won't eat, let them drink." The battle went terribly, which naturally only strengthened belief in omens. But birds and sneezes aren't the only everyday signals you're expected to interpret. You're walking down a street when someone suddenly stops in front of you. A black dog crosses the path. A woman mutters something under her breath and turns around, heading back the way she came. Bad sign. Across many ancient societies, unexpected encounters, especially with certain animals, could signal disaster ahead. Dogs sometimes symbolized death or the underworld. In ancient Greece, dogs were associated with Hades and his famously intimidating pet, Cerberus. So if one crosses your path in a strange way, maybe today is not the day to start your journey. And honestly, ancient travel is dangerous enough without supernatural warnings. Roads are rough, bandits exist, and there's always the possibility you accidentally offend a river spirit halfway through your trip. You'd probably listen to the dog. But here's where things get interesting. Superstitions often grow strongest when people face uncertainty. Ancient farmers lived at the mercy of weather, disease, and unpredictable harvests. If your crops failed, it wasn't just bad luck. It might mean you missed a warning sign. Maybe you ignored that owl hooting outside the house. Owls, by the way, had extremely mixed reputations. In some places, they symbolized wisdom, thanks partly to the Greek goddess Athena. But in many cultures, they were deeply ominous, associated with night, death, and spirits. Imagine hearing one outside your window in a silent village. No streetlights, no cars, just darkness. Yeah, suddenly that owl sounds less like wisdom and more like a ghost with feathers. Quirky superstition texts from ancient Babylon go even further. Some omen tablets list thousands of possible signs. If a sheep is born with 2 heads, if lightning strikes a certain direction, if a dog enters a palace, if a man dreams of eating a lion, each scenario had its own prediction. It's basically the ancient version of a massive instruction manual for interpreting reality. And yet, even scholars today are still puzzling over how seriously people treated all of it. Historians still argue whether these omen catalogs were everyday guides for normal people or mainly used by specialized priests who interpreted signs for kings and officials. But one thing is clear. The ancient world believed the universe was constantly talking, and you were expected to listen. A sudden breeze through the market, a strange animal cry, a pot breaking on the floor. None of it was meaningless. You're walking through a world where coincidence doesn't exist. Everything is a message. Even that mirror in a nearby stall, polished bronze reflecting your slightly confused face, holds its own mysterious reputation. Because in many cultures, reflections aren't just reflections. They might be pieces of your soul. And if that mirror were to shatter, well, let's just say ancient people would immediately start worrying about their next 7 years. You're still wandering through the market when a sudden clatter makes everyone nearby flinch. A polished bronze mirror slips from a merchant's hands and crashes onto the stone floor. The metal disc bends, the reflective surface splitting into jagged lines that scatter your reflection into several slightly unsettling versions of yourself. The merchant freezes. A woman nearby gasps softly. No one rushes to help. Instead, everyone is staring at the broken mirror the way modern people stare at a cracked phone screen, except with far more existential dread. Because in the ancient world, mirrors aren't just tools for checking whether your hair looks acceptable. There's something stranger, something a little mystical, a surface that holds a piece of you. And now it's broken. The belief that mirrors contain or reflect part of the soul appears in several ancient cultures. Early mirrors weren't glass like ours. They were polished metal, bronze, silver, sometimes even obsidian. When people looked into them, the reflection felt mysterious, almost magical. After all, how exactly did a flat piece of metal contain a moving version of your face? No one had a physics explanation, so naturally, the supernatural stepped in. Many believed reflections were connected to the spirit. Damage the reflection, and you might damage the soul. That's where the famous 7 years of bad luck eventually grows from. The Romans believed the human body renewed itself every 7 years. So if your soul, or its reflection, was harmed, it would take 7 years for things to reset. Which, frankly, feels like a pretty long punishment for dropping a mirror before coffee. Historians still argue whether this belief was widespread among everyday Romans or mainly recorded in later folklore traditions. But the connection between mirrors and the soul shows up again and again in ancient thought. And once you notice it, you start seeing the same fear everywhere. Take black cats, for example. Across many parts of the ancient Mediterranean world, cats were both admired and deeply suspicious creatures. In ancient Egypt, they were sacred animals associated with the goddess Bastet, protector of homes and families. Hurting a cat in Egypt could actually lead to severe punishment, even death in some cases. That's how seriously people took their divine status. But move outside Egypt and things get complicated. Cats are quiet. They appear and disappear in shadows. Their eyes glow strangely in low light. And they have the unsettling habit of staring at absolutely nothing for long periods of time. If you've ever owned a cat, you already know they sometimes behave like tiny supernatural investigators. In many cultures, black animals especially gained eerie reputations. The color black was often associated with night, death, or the unknown. A black cat crossing your path could easily become interpreted as a warning from the universe. Though interestingly, not every culture agreed it was bad luck. In parts of ancient Britain and Scotland, black cats were sometimes considered lucky. Sailors' families even kept them at home, believing they protected ships at sea, which just proves something important about superstition. It's rarely consistent. The same animal can mean good luck in one village and absolute disaster 2 villages away. And honestly, from the cat's perspective, it's probably very confusing. You continue through the town and notice people being surprisingly careful with reflections. A woman cleaning her home avoids leaving mirrors uncovered at night. A child is scolded for playing with a polished bowl like it's a toy mirror. These habits echo a belief that reflections could attract or trap spirits. In some ancient traditions, and later medieval ones, mirrors were covered after someone died. The idea was that the departing spirit might become trapped in the reflection instead of moving on properly. Even today, certain cultures still practice this. Which is fascinating because it means a superstition possibly thousands of years old quietly survives in modern funeral customs. Quirky historical tidbit: in parts of ancient China, mirrors were sometimes used as protective objects. Polished bronze mirrors could be placed in homes to reflect away evil spirits. So in that case, reflections weren't dangerous, they were defensive equipment. It's basically the ancient version of installing a spiritual security system. And once again, historians still argue whether everyday households truly believed these mirrors physically repelled spirits, or whether the practice gradually became symbolic over time. But regardless of the exact belief, the idea was powerful enough to shape behavior. Back in the street, the merchant finally sighs and kneels to pick up the broken mirror. He mutters a quiet prayer. No one laughs. Because even if you're not completely convinced the soul lives in reflections, why risk it? Superstition thrives in that small space between belief and uncertainty. You might not fully believe it, but you definitely don't want to test it. As you keep walking, you pass another small crowd gathered around a storyteller. He's describing strange omens involving animals, especially creatures that move silently in the dark. Cats, owls, snakes, animals that seem to know something humans don't. And among these creatures, few inspire more nervous whispers than the gaze of another human being. Not just any gaze, the wrong gaze, a jealous one. Because across the ancient world, from Greece to Persia to North Africa, people feared something far more subtle than broken mirrors or unlucky cats. They feared a look, a glance filled with envy, a single stare believed capable of causing sickness, misfortune, or even death. A curse with no spell, no chant, just eyes. And once you start believing in something like that, you begin to notice those eyes everywhere. Watching. You begin to feel it before anyone explains it to you. That subtle shift in the crowd when someone stares a little too long. The quick glance away when eyes meet. The casual compliments that somehow sound slightly nervous. Because in much of the ancient world, admiration is dangerous. Too much praise might attract envy. And envy, people believe, can carry real power. You're hearing whispers about something called the evil eye. It's one of the oldest and most widespread superstitions in human history. Long before social media envy or neighborhood gossip, people feared that a jealous look could bring genuine harm. Crops might fail, a child might fall ill, a cow might stop producing milk, and all of it could be blamed on one thing: someone looking at you with resentment in their heart. The ancient Greeks called it Baskania. The Romans had their own version, Malocchio. Versions of the belief appear across the Middle East, North Africa, India, and parts of Europe. Different languages, same uneasy idea. Someone's eyes might hurt you. And when you step into an ancient village, you quickly realize people are constantly trying to avoid triggering it. Imagine a mother proudly showing her newborn baby to visitors. Instead of saying, "What a beautiful child," someone might deliberately soften the compliment. The baby looks strong. Or they'll quickly add a protective phrase after praising the child, because too much admiration might attract envy, and envy might activate the evil eye. It's basically the ancient version of saying, "Don't jinx it." One of the earliest written references appears in ancient Mesopotamian texts. Clay tablets from around 3,000 years ago include incantations designed specifically to protect against harmful glances. Priests even created small figurines meant to absorb the curse. Which means, somewhere in ancient Babylon, someone was probably thinking, "I swear my neighbor looked at my goat funny, and now it refuses to produce milk." Stranger things have happened. Mainstream historical evidence shows that belief in the evil eye was extremely common in ancient Greece. Philosophers like Plutarch even discussed it. Some Greeks believed the human eye could emit invisible rays carrying harmful intent. It sounds strange today, but remember, ancient thinkers were trying to explain the power of emotion and jealousy without modern psychology. And honestly, if looks could kill during awkward family dinners, humanity would have gone extinct centuries ago. Historians still argue whether people believed the evil eye worked through literal physical energy or through divine punishment triggered by envy. Some scholars suggest it may have functioned as a social warning system, discouraging people from boasting too much or provoking jealousy. Which actually makes sense. If a culture believes envy can cause disasters, people will naturally behave more modestly. Superstition becomes social etiquette. You begin noticing protective measures everywhere. Amulets shaped like eyes. Hand gestures meant to deflect curses. Little charms hanging above doorways. One of the most recognizable symbols is a blue, eye-shaped bead, something still used widely today across Turkey and parts of the Mediterranean. It's meant to reflect the evil eye back toward the person who sent it. The logic is beautifully simple. If someone tries to curse you with their gaze, the charm stares right back. Ancient people loved clever spiritual loopholes. Quirky historical detail. In ancient Rome, certain statues had exaggerated, almost comically large phallus shapes placed at doorways or crossroads. Yes, really. These weren't meant to be offensive. They were believed to ward off the evil eye through humor and distraction. The idea was that a shocking or ridiculous object would draw attention away from anything vulnerable nearby. Basically, if someone's going to stare, you give them something absurd to stare at instead. It's an ancient strategy that still works surprisingly well on the internet. Children, especially, are considered vulnerable. In many ancient cultures, babies were thought to attract envy easily because they represented hope, beauty, and future success. Protective rituals became extremely common. Charms tied to cradles, special markings on the forehead, even deliberate smudges of dirt placed on a child's face to make them appear less perfect. The goal wasn't bad hygiene, it was camouflage. Nothing special here, the parents silently signal to the universe. Move along. In some regions, people also performed small counter-rituals if they suspected the evil eye had struck. Olive oil drops in water, whispered prayers, or burning herbs to cleanse the air. And if the bad luck continued? Well, obviously the curse must have been strong. You're starting to notice a pattern now. Superstitions grow strongest around things people care about most: health, children, food, safety. Things ancient life constantly threatened. And the evil eye gave people something oddly comforting: an explanation. If disaster struck, at least there was a reason. Maybe someone envied you. Maybe someone looked too long. Maybe someone admired your crops a little too enthusiastically. And while that idea might sound unsettling, it also means something else. If curses can travel through glances, then protection might travel through objects, through symbols, through charms. Which is exactly why the next house you enter is filled with tiny protective items hanging from walls, necklaces, belts, and door frames. Because in a world full of invisible dangers, people don't just watch for bad eyes. They arm themselves against them. And some of those tiny objects, those simple little charms, will become some of the most powerful symbols in human superstition. You step inside the house and immediately notice something unusual. It's not the clay walls or the flickering oil lamps. It's the sheer number of small objects hanging everywhere. Tiny beads tied with thread, little carved stones resting near the doorway, a necklace dangling from a wooden peg beside the bed. At first glance, the room looks like it's been decorated by someone who really enjoys accessories. But none of these objects are decoration. They're protection. In the ancient world, life feels a bit like walking through invisible crossfire. Curses, jealous glances, wandering spirits, angry gods. There are a lot of things that might be targeting you at any given moment. And since you can't exactly install a divine firewall, people rely on the next best thing. Charms, amulets, little portable shields against the supernatural. You pick up a small stone pendant sitting on a nearby table. It's carved with a symbol that vaguely resembles an eye. The edges are worn smooth from years of handling. Objects like this appear all across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and even farther east, people carry charms believed to block harmful forces. The basic idea is wonderfully practical. If bad energy is floating around out there somewhere, maybe a small object can absorb it before it reaches you. Ancient Egyptians were particularly enthusiastic about this concept. If you walk through an Egyptian marketplace around 1500 BCE, you'll see people wearing amulets everywhere, around their necks, stitched into clothing, sometimes even wrapped inside bandages around the body. One of the most famous is the Eye of Horus. According to Egyptian mythology, The god Horus lost his eye during a cosmic battle with his uncle Set. The eye was later restored, symbolizing healing and protection. Because of that story, Egyptians believed the symbol could guard against illness and injury. Archaeologists have found thousands of these amulets buried with mummies. The reasoning was simple. If you're going to travel through the afterlife, you might as well pack some protective gear. Quirky historical tidbit. Some Egyptian amulets were shaped like tiny frogs. Frogs symbolized fertility and rebirth because they appeared in huge numbers after the Nile floods. So wearing a frog charm was basically the ancient version of saying, "I'd like some good luck with life continuing, please." And honestly, frogs are cute enough that it's hard to argue with the strategy. Historians still argue whether people believed these charms had literal supernatural power or whether they functioned more like psychological comfort. After all, holding a protective object can make you feel safer, even if you're not entirely sure why. But for ancient people, belief and symbolism blended together easily. And sometimes the charms got creative. In ancient Rome, children often wore something called a bulla. It was a small locket hung around the neck that contained protective items, sometimes herbs, sometimes tiny symbols meant to ward off evil spirits. Roman boys wore these until they reached adulthood. Imagine carrying a little anti-ghost necklace through your entire childhood. Though considering how strange the ancient world could be, that might not be the worst idea. Adults had their own charms too. Travelers might carry protective stones. Soldiers sometimes wore engraved rings believed to bring victory or protection in battle. Sailors tied knots in ropes or carried lucky objects onto ships. And once again, you see a pattern forming. Superstition loves uncertainty. The more unpredictable life becomes, the more appealing it is to carry something, anything that promises protection. You glance toward the doorway of the house. Hanging above it is another small object, a carved hand symbol. Hands appear in protective symbols across several ancient cultures. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, the open hand became associated with protection against the evil eye. The symbol eventually evolved into what many people today recognize as the Hamsa. The idea behind it is strangely comforting. An open palm facing outward signals stop. Stop bad spirits. Stop jealous glances. Stop whatever unseen nonsense might be floating toward your house. It's like the universe's most polite but firm security guard. And the charm doesn't just protect people, it protects places. Homes are especially vulnerable in ancient belief systems. A household contains children, food stores, animals, and family members. If something supernatural wants to cause trouble, that's the perfect target. So doorways become spiritual checkpoints. Amulets hang near entrances. Symbols are carved into thresholds. Sometimes small offerings are left nearby for protective spirits. It's basically ancient home security, except instead of cameras and alarm systems, you have tiny frog necklaces and carved eyeballs, which, depending on the ghost, might actually be just as effective. As you sit in the quiet room, you notice the owner carefully adjusting one of the hanging charms. Not nervously, just routinely. That's the interesting thing about superstition. After a while, it stops feeling dramatic. It becomes part of daily life. You don't panic about spirits every moment. You simply make sure your protections are in place. A charm by the door, an amulet around the neck, maybe a quick prayer before sleep. Because the unseen world doesn't only send warnings through birds or curses through jealous eyes. Sometimes it communicates in another way entirely, through dreams. And tonight, when the oil lamps finally dim and the house grows silent, people will lie down expecting something more than rest. They'll be waiting for messages. Because in the ancient world, dreams are rarely just dreams. They're letters from somewhere beyond waking life. And if you wake up remembering one clearly, someone might insist it means something very important. Night settles over the town slowly. The market noise fades. Oil lamps flicker out one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, then thinks better of it and stops. You lie down on a woven mat inside the quiet house, listening to the faint crackle of the last lamp burning low. And here's the thing about going to sleep in the ancient world. People expect something to happen. Not every night, of course, but often enough that dreams are taken very seriously. If you wake up remembering one clearly, you don't just shrug and say, "Huh, weird." You tell someone, possibly a priest, possibly the local dream interpreter. Because in this era, dreams are not random brain activity. They are messages, sometimes from gods, sometimes from spirits, occasionally from ancestors who apparently decided midnight is the best time to deliver advice. Ancient cultures across the world share this belief. Egyptians, Greeks, Mesopotamians, and Romans all leave behind written records about dream interpretation. And they didn't just casually discuss dreams, they built entire systems around them. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets contain detailed dream manuals. If you dream about flying, it might mean success is coming. If you dream about falling, well, perhaps prepare for trouble. There were even official interpreters whose job was to decode these messages. Imagine waking up, walking into town, and saying, "Good morning. I dreamed about eating a lion. Should I be concerned?" And the interpreter calmly flipping through a clay tablet, like it's an ancient version of a dream dictionary. Eating a lion. That could mean victory over enemies, or possibly indigestion. Let's consult the next tablet. The Egyptians take dream interpretation even further. Around 1300 BCE, scribes create what scholars now call the dream book. It lists dozens of dreams along with predictions labeled either good or bad. You dream about seeing yourself dead? Good. Dream about looking out a window? Bad. Which feels slightly backwards, but ancient symbolism had its own logic. The belief wasn't just casual curiosity, it influenced real decisions. Mainstream historical fact. Greek temples sometimes offered a ritual called dream incubation. People seeking guidance would sleep inside sacred temples dedicated to healing gods, like Asclepius. The idea was that the god might appear in a dream and provide instructions for curing illness. Archaeologists have found inscriptions left by visitors describing dreams where the god advised specific treatments. In other words, ancient healthcare occasionally involved divine sleep consultations. Historians still argue whether these experiences were interpreted literally or whether temple priests helped guide people toward symbolic interpretations. Some scholars suspect that the environment itself, quiet temples, ritual preparation, expectation, made dreams feel extremely vivid. But to the person waking up from one, the message probably felt very real. You can imagine someone rising at dawn, eyes wide, whispering, "The god told me to bathe in cold water and stop eating so much cheese." Which, honestly, might have been pretty good advice. Quirky historical detail. Some dream interpreters believed the position you slept in affected the type of dream you received. Sleeping on your right side might bring good visions. Sleeping on your left could invite strange or troubling dreams. So if someone had a nightmare, the first suggestion might be simple. Try flipping over tonight. It's the ancient equivalent of turning your phone off and on again. But dreams weren't always comforting. Some dreams were considered warnings. A king might dream of a collapsing tower and interpret it as a sign his kingdom was in danger. A farmer might dream of dead crops and worry the harvest would fail. Entire political decisions could be influenced by dreams.
One famous example involves Alexander the Great. Ancient sources claim he once dreamed about a satyr dancing on a shield during a military campaign. His advisors interpreted it as a symbol predicting victory over the city of Tyre. Now, historians still debate whether this dream was recorded accurately or added later by storytellers who loved dramatic symbolism. But the story itself shows how deeply dreams shaped ancient thinking. If a leader believed the gods had spoken through sleep, ignoring that message felt risky. Back in the quiet house, you notice something else about nighttime beliefs. People sometimes leave small offerings beside the bed: bread, oil, water. These might be meant for protective spirits, or simply symbolic gestures of respect to whatever unseen forces might be passing through dreams. Because dreams were thought to be doorways. And doors, as we've learned tonight, are places where strange things can pass through. You drift towards sleep now, hearing distant night insects humming outside the walls, and you start wondering what kind of dream might appear tonight. Maybe something symbolic, maybe something prophetic, maybe something extremely confusing involving goats, rivers, and a giant talking owl, which, according to some ancient dream manuals, could mean anything from prosperity to impending doom.
Very helpful, obviously. But not every strange event in the ancient world happens during sleep. Sometimes misfortune arrives in daylight. A cow dies unexpectedly. A child falls ill. A storm ruins the crops. And when bad luck strikes repeatedly, people start looking around for someone responsible. Not a god, not a dream, a person. Because if misfortune keeps happening, someone in the village might be whispering the wrong words, performing the wrong rituals, or quietly sending curses into the night. And once suspicion begins spreading like that, superstition can turn from protective to dangerous. Because suddenly the problem isn't spirits or omens anymore. It's your neighbor. Morning arrives slowly, the sky turning pale above the rooftops, while smoke begins curling out of cooking fires across the village. People step outside, stretch their backs, and start another day of ordinary life. But something feels tense. A cow in the next courtyard has died overnight. No wounds, no obvious illness, just collapsed sometime during the dark hours. The owner stands beside it, looking deeply troubled. And not just because losing livestock is expensive. People are whispering. Because when misfortune strikes without a clear reason, ancient communities often turn toward an explanation that feels both frightening and strangely convenient. Someone must have caused it. Not by accident, by magic. Welcome to the world of curses and whispered spells. Across ancient civilizations, from Greece and Rome to Egypt and the Near East, people believed certain individuals could manipulate unseen forces. Sometimes these figures were respected healers or priests. Other times they were feared as witches or sorcerers. And the difference between those labels could be extremely thin. A woman who knows herbal remedies might be admired one day and suspected the next if something goes wrong nearby. The cow dies. A storm ruins crops. A child becomes sick. Someone inevitably asks the dangerous question: who might have cursed us? Mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of ancient curse tablets, especially in Greek and Roman territories. These small sheets of lead were scratched with names and requests, asking supernatural powers to harm enemies. People would roll them up, sometimes pierce them with nails, and bury them in graves or sacred wells. The logic was simple. Spirits of the underworld were believed to have influence over the living world. If you placed a curse tablet where spirits could find it, they might carry out the request. Imagine writing a note that basically says, "Dear underworld spirits, please make Marcus lose his upcoming court case and possibly develop a mild but embarrassing rash." Ancient people did not always aim small. Some curse tablets asked for rivals to lose business, athletes to fail in competitions, or romantic rivals to suffer terrible luck. It's basically the ancient version of leaving a very aggressive online review. Historians still argue whether most people truly believed these curses worked or whether they served as psychological relief, letting someone feel like justice was being pursued, even if nothing supernatural actually happened. But belief was strong enough that accusations of sorcery could become serious. You walk through the village and hear murmurs about a woman who lives on the edge of town.
She's known for gathering herbs at odd hours. She mutters to herself sometimes. A few villagers swear they've seen strange lights near her house at night, which, to be fair, might simply be someone cooking soup. But in a superstitious environment, ordinary behavior can quickly become suspicious. Ancient texts show that fear of witchcraft existed in many societies. The Greeks told stories of witches like Medea, who used potions and spells to control events.
Roman writers described sorcerers who could summon spirits or curse enemies. Even the famous Roman poet Horace wrote satirical scenes about witches gathering strange ingredients under moonlight. Quirky historical tidbit. Some ancient spells involved incredibly bizarre components, things like bat wings, graveyard dust, or the hair of a person you disliked. Which raises an important question. How exactly did people obtain these ingredients without attracting suspicion? Imagine knocking on someone's door and saying, "Hello, may I borrow a small amount of your hair for totally normal reasons?" It probably didn't go smoothly. Despite the dramatic stories, not everyone practicing magic was seen as dangerous. In many places, there were also respected practitioners of good magic. Healers used herbs, charms, and protective rituals to cure illness or remove curses. The line between medicine and magic often blurred. For example, ancient Egyptian medical papyri contain treatments combining practical remedies with protective spells. A doctor might prescribe both herbal ointments and spoken incantations. Because if illness could have supernatural causes, then healing might require supernatural help too. And honestly, when you're sick in a world without antibiotics, you're probably willing to try both. Still, fear of malicious magic lingered. If several unlucky events happened in a row, suspicion could spread quickly. A farmer loses crops. A family member falls ill. Another animal dies mysteriously. People begin connecting dots that may or may not exist. That's the dangerous thing about superstition. It tries to impose patterns on chaos. And sometimes those patterns point toward real human targets. Historians still argue how often accusations of witchcraft led to serious punishment in the ancient world, compared with later periods like the medieval witch trials. Evidence suggests that while belief in sorcery was widespread, large-scale persecutions were less common in earlier civilizations. But the fear was real, and fear has a way of shaping behavior. You notice villagers performing small protective actions, tying charms to animals, sprinkling herbs near doorways, whispering prayers before meals. No one wants to become the next victim of a curse, or the next person blamed for one. Meanwhile, beyond the village fields, something else is happening. A group of priests stands on a hilltop, watching the sky carefully. They're not worried about witches or curse tablets. They're watching birds. Because sometimes the universe doesn't whisper its warnings through spells or dreams. Sometimes it flaps directly overhead. And if you know how to read the flight of wings across the sky, you might believe the gods themselves are revealing the future. You follow the path up the hill where a small group of priests stands facing the open sky. They're very quiet, not the awkward quiet of strangers waiting for a bus, more like the focused silence of people listening for something important. One priest shades his eyes with his hand. Another holds a wooden staff carved with markings that probably mean something very official. All of them are staring upward. At first, you think they might be watching clouds, but then you notice the birds. Several dark shapes glide across the sky, circling lazily in the warm morning air. The priests track every movement with careful attention, occasionally murmuring to one another as if discussing a complicated chess match. Because in many ancient cultures, birds are not just birds. They are messengers, and sometimes they're considered the literal handwriting of the gods. The practice of interpreting bird behavior, known historically as augury, was especially important in ancient Rome. Specially trained priests called augurs studied how birds flew, where they landed, and even how they sounded. From this, they believed they could determine whether the gods approved of certain actions, which is how you end up with one of history's most unusual government jobs, official bird interpreter for the Roman Republic. Mainstream historical fact: Roman augurs played a crucial role in politics. Major decisions like holding elections, passing laws, or starting military campaigns often required favorable omens first. If the signs looked bad, the event could be postponed. Imagine modern politics working that way. Unfortunately, the Senate vote has been delayed because 3 pigeons flew left instead of right. Honestly, that might improve some debates. The logic behind augury comes from a simple ancient assumption: gods control nature. If gods want to send messages, the natural world becomes their message board. Birds are perfect for this role. They move between earth and sky, which ancient thinkers saw as the domain of divine beings. Watching their flight patterns felt like watching communication from above. Different birds carried different meanings. Eagles were powerful symbols linked to Jupiter, the king of Roman gods. Ravens and crows were often considered mysterious or prophetic. Owls, as you remember from earlier tonight, had a slightly spooky reputation thanks to their nighttime habits. Quirky historical detail: Roman augurs divided the sky into imaginary sections when observing birds. If a bird appeared in one zone, it might mean good fortune. Another zone might mean disaster. So reading omens required a kind of mental map of the heavens. It's like ancient sky-based Wi-Fi coverage zones. Good signal over here. Terrible divine reception over there. Historians still argue how sincerely political leaders believed these omens versus how often they used them strategically. After all, if you're a politician and the birds suddenly say the meeting should be canceled, that's a very convenient excuse. Sorry, everyone. The gods say no. Hard to argue with that. But birds weren't the only animals thought to reveal fate. You remember those sacred chickens mentioned earlier? The ones consulted before battles? Roman military commanders sometimes carried cages of these birds specifically for omen reading. The ritual was simple: scatter grain and watch. If the chickens ate eagerly, it meant the gods favored the upcoming battle. If they refused, well, maybe reconsider your life choices. Of course, history records moments when leaders ignored these warnings, and when things went badly afterward, people loved pointing out the obvious lesson: never underestimate poultry prophecy. Beyond Rome, other cultures also watched animals closely. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests sometimes examined the livers of sacrificed animals to predict the future. This practice, called hepatoscopy, sounds unusual today, but was considered highly sophisticated at the time. Clay models of sheep livers have even been discovered, marked with different sections used for interpreting signs. Imagine studying a liver the way a meteorologist studies weather charts. This ridge here suggests possible victory, but that small indentation could indicate unexpected rain or political scandal. Not exactly the prediction you want before invading somewhere. Meanwhile, in ancient China, divination sometimes involved heating animal bones until they cracked, then interpreting the fracture patterns. These are called oracle bones, and some of the earliest Chinese writing appears on them, which means one of humanity's oldest writing systems developed partly from trying to ask questions like, will the harvest succeed? Will the king's journey go well? Should we maybe postpone that war? Across continents, cultures invent different methods, but the idea is the same. The universe leaves clues. You just have to know where to look. Standing on the hilltop now, you watch the priests quietly discussing the birds overhead. One eagle suddenly swoops across the sky from right to left. The men exchange serious glances. Is that good? Bad? Hard to say unless you've memorized the entire celestial bird manual. But one thing is clear. Animals aren't random in this worldview. Their movements reflect hidden forces shaping human life. And once people start seeing patterns in nature, they begin noticing patterns in other places too. Numbers, for example. Certain numbers seem to appear again and again in rituals, myths, and everyday habits. Some bring luck, others bring dread. And before long, entire civilizations start treating certain numbers as if they carry invisible power. So while the priests continue watching the sky for winged messages, people down in the village are quietly arranging their lives around numbers they believe shape destiny. Because sometimes the future isn't written in the flight of birds. Sometimes it's hiding inside simple arithmetic. As you walk back down the hill toward the village, you start noticing something subtle but strangely consistent. People are counting. A merchant arranges clay jars into groups before opening his stall. A woman carefully ties 3 knots into a cord hanging by her doorway. Nearby, a farmer pauses while stacking stones and adjusts the pile so there are exactly 7. No one explains it. They just do it. Because in the ancient world, numbers aren't just tools for mathematics. They're symbols loaded with meaning, luck, and sometimes deep cosmic importance. You might think numbers are neutral. 1, 2, 3, just counting things. Ancient cultures strongly disagreed. Certain numbers seem to appear again and again in myths, rituals, and religious traditions. After a while, people began believing those numbers carried power. Take the number 7. You've probably heard it before. 7 days in a week, 7 wonders of the world, lucky number 7 in games today. But its mystical reputation stretches far back into antiquity. In ancient Mesopotamia, 7 was considered sacred, partly because people could see 7 major celestial bodies moving in the sky: the sun, the moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. Those were the only planets visible to the naked eye. 7 moving lights in the heavens. 7 powerful forces. Over time, the number became associated with divine order and cosmic structure. Historians still argue whether the 7-day week developed purely from astronomical observation or whether cultural symbolism played an equally large role. But once the number became embedded in tradition, it spread widely. Even today, you probably don't question why a week has 7 days. Ancient superstition quietly shaped your calendar. You notice a child hopping along the street, counting steps aloud. 1, 2, 3, but when he reaches 13, he stops abruptly and skips ahead. 14. It seems playful at first, but that little hesitation hints at something deeper.
The number 13 has long carried an unlucky reputation in parts of the world. While the superstition becomes especially famous in later European traditions, its roots may stretch back to ancient symbolic thinking. 12 was often considered a complete number. 12 months, 12 zodiac signs, 12 Olympian gods in Greek mythology. Add one more, and suddenly the neat order feels disrupted. 13 becomes the awkward extra chair at the cosmic dinner table. Quirky historical tidbit: in some ancient gatherings, people avoided seating 13 guests at a meal because it was believed someone might soon die. Which sounds dramatic, but honestly, awkward dinner parties are terrifying in any century. Numbers also played a role in protective magic. You see a woman whispering something quietly while tying knots in a thread bracelet. 3 knots, not 2, not 4, 3. The number 3 appears constantly in ancient rituals, possibly because it's the smallest number that feels like a pattern. 1 is alone, 2 is balance, but 3 feels complete. Greek myths are full of triads: the 3 fates, the 3 graces, the 3-headed dog guarding the underworld. Romans repeated actions 3 times during ceremonies for emphasis. Even today, people instinctively repeat things in 3s. Knock 3 times. Say something 3 times for good luck. Apparently, the human brain really enjoys a good trilogy. But not every number inspires comfort. The number 4, for example, developed an unlucky reputation in parts of East Asia thousands of years ago because its pronunciation resembled the word for death in certain languages. So buildings sometimes avoided the 4th floor entirely, which means long before modern skyscrapers quietly skipped floor numbers, ancient superstition was already editing architecture. Numbers also guided everyday choices. Farmers planted crops on specific days believed to be lucky. Travelers avoided journeys beginning on unlucky dates. Merchants might price goods using numbers associated with prosperity. None of these rules were universal. Superstitions varied wildly between regions and cultures, but the underlying idea remained consistent. Numbers weren't random. They carried meaning. You pass a small shrine near the village well, where someone has placed 7 small stones around a clay bowl. Inside the bowl floats a bit of oil and a few herbs. A protective ritual, perhaps, or maybe a simple tradition passed down for generations without anyone remembering exactly why. Historians still argue about this, too: how many ancient rituals originally had clear symbolic explanations, and how many eventually became habits people followed simply because that's the way it's done. And honestly, that happens all the time. Think about how many things you do automatically today without remembering the original reason. Tradition has a way of outliving its own instructions. But while numbers shape daily routines quietly, something else lurks at the edges of ancient belief, something far more unsettling. Because when the sun sets again and the village grows dark, people will start worrying about creatures that don't care about lucky numbers. Things that move silently through empty streets, shapes glimpsed at the corner of your vision, figures that might not belong to the living world at all. In ancient towns, the boundary between life and death often feels thin, and once night falls, people become very careful about wandering outside, because they believe the dead might be wandering too. The sun sinks behind the hills, and with it goes most of the village's courage. You notice the change immediately. Doors close earlier, lamps glow softly inside homes, but fewer people linger in the streets. Conversations become quieter, almost cautious, because night belongs to something else. During the day, people worry about omens, numbers, curses, and jealous glances. But after sunset, a different superstition takes center stage, one that has followed humanity across nearly every civilization. The belief that the dead do not always stay where they're supposed to. You step carefully along the dim street as darkness thickens around the clay houses. The air cools, carrying faint smells of smoke and damp earth. Somewhere an owl calls, and a few villagers glance nervously toward the sound. Owls again. They really cannot catch a break in ancient reputations. Ghosts, spirits of the deceased who linger among the living, appear in stories from ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and China. The details vary, but the basic idea is surprisingly consistent. If the dead aren't properly honored, they might come back. Not always dramatically. Sometimes they simply wander. Sometimes they appear in dreams. And sometimes they cause small disturbances that make people deeply uncomfortable. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe restless spirits called gidim. These ghosts were believed to be the souls of people who hadn't received proper burial rites, or whose descendants failed to maintain offerings. Without food or remembrance in the afterlife, they might drift back into the living world seeking attention. Which sounds tragic, until one of them starts knocking over your pottery at midnight. Mainstream historical fact. Mesopotamians practiced regular ancestor offerings partly to prevent exactly this problem. Families left food, drink, and prayers to keep spirits satisfied. Think of it as maintaining a peaceful long-distance relationship with your ancestors. Neglect them and things might get awkward. The Greeks had similar fears. In their tradition, the dead normally traveled to the underworld ruled by Hades. But certain souls, especially those who died violently or without proper burial, might remain stuck between worlds. These wandering spirits were sometimes called atai or eoroi, depending on the circumstances. You can imagine why burial rituals were taken so seriously. If someone died and their body wasn't properly buried, people believed their spirit could roam endlessly. This belief becomes famously important in Greek literature. In Homer's Odyssey, the ghost of a fallen warrior named Elpenor begs Odysseus to bury his body properly so his soul can finally rest. Even ancient storytellers understood. Nobody wants to be the ghost stuck haunting the parking lot of eternity. Historians still argue whether most ancient people imagined ghosts as fully visible apparitions or more subtle presences, strange noises, sudden chills, or unsettling dreams. But written accounts suggest people genuinely feared encountering them, which is why nighttime habits became carefully controlled. You see it in small details. A family leaving a lamp burning near the doorway. Someone quietly muttering a prayer before stepping outside after dark. Another person placing a small offering of bread near a household shrine. These acts aren't dramatic ghost hunting rituals. They're gentle precautions. A polite way of saying to the unseen world, everything is fine here. No need to visit. Quirky historical tidbit. The Romans even had an annual festival specifically dedicated to dealing with restless spirits. It was called Lemuria. During this event, families performed nighttime rituals to drive away wandering ghosts from their homes. The head of the household would walk barefoot through the house at midnight, tossing black beans behind him while chanting a phrase meant to appease the spirits. Apparently, ghosts were expected to stop and collect the beans, which raises several questions, mainly why ghosts are so easily distracted by legumes. But if it worked, it worked. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was resolution. Here are some beans. Please take them and move along peacefully. And honestly, that feels like a very polite way to handle supernatural visitors. You continue walking down the dark street, noticing how quickly shadows deepen in places where lamps don't reach. Every quiet corner feels like it might be hiding something. Not necessarily a terrifying apparition, just the possibility.
That's often how superstition works. Fear thrives in uncertainty. A creaking door becomes a spirit. A strange sound becomes a ghostly whisper. A cool breeze brushing your neck suddenly feels very personal. And if someone claims they saw something unusual last night, well, the story spreads quickly. Soon everyone remembers hearing strange noises too. Soon someone swears they saw a pale figure near the well. Soon the entire village becomes slightly uneasy after sunset. But there's a reason people developed careful burial traditions in the first place. Proper rituals were believed to keep the boundary between worlds intact. Honor the dead, respect the transition, and hopefully the spirits stay where they belong. Because if burial rites are skipped or done incorrectly, people feared something far worse than a wandering ghost. They feared the dead might refuse to rest entirely. Which is why the next place you'll visit isn't a home or a marketplace. It's the burial grounds outside the village, where people perform very specific rituals designed to keep the dead peaceful, and very definitely inside their graves. The burial grounds sit just beyond the village fields, where the earth grows quieter and the air carries that faint, dusty smell of dry grass and old stone. You walk slowly between rows of simple graves. Some are marked with carved stones. Others are little more than raised mounds of earth. A few have small offerings placed beside them, bowls, flowers, sometimes bits of bread left by family members earlier in the day. In the ancient world, burial is not just about honoring the dead. It's about keeping them calm. Because, as you've already started noticing, people here don't fully trust the boundary between the living and the dead. They believe that if something goes wrong during burial rituals, if the proper prayers aren't spoken, if the body isn't prepared correctly, if the grave isn't sealed properly, then the person resting below might not stay at rest. And when the dead refuse to stay buried, things become very uncomfortable for the living. Across ancient civilizations, burial practices developed not only from religious belief, but also from deep superstition about what might happen if those practices were ignored. Take ancient Egypt. Egyptian burial customs are among the most elaborate in history. Bodies were carefully preserved through mummification, wrapped in layers of linen, and placed inside decorated coffins along with food, jewelry, and protective charms. Mainstream historical fact. Egyptians believed the soul consisted of multiple parts, such as the Ka and the Ba, which needed a preserved body and proper rituals to function in the afterlife. If the body decayed too quickly or was destroyed, the soul might lose its anchor, and that could lead to serious spiritual problems. Historians still argue whether Egyptians feared their dead returning as ghosts in the same way other cultures did, but there's clear evidence they believed restless spirits could cause misfortune if burial rites were neglected, which explains why tombs were treated almost like long-term housing, furniture, food, amulets, sometimes even board games for the afterlife. Because eternity can get boring if you don't pack entertainment. You pass a grave where someone has recently placed a small clay jar filled with oil. Offerings like this appear across many cultures. In ancient Greece, families returned to graves regularly with gifts: wine, bread, honey cakes, and flowers. These offerings were meant to nourish the spirit of the deceased and maintain goodwill between the living and the dead. Think of it as a kind of spiritual maintenance schedule. Skip too many visits, and the ancestors might get annoyed. Quirky historical detail. Some ancient burials included small coins placed in the mouth or hand of the deceased. In Greek tradition, this coin was payment for Charon, the ferryman who transported souls across the river Styx into the underworld. No coin, no ride, which leaves your soul stuck waiting at the riverbank like someone who forgot their bus fare. Historians debate how widespread this practice actually was, but archaeological discoveries confirm that coins appear in many ancient graves across the Mediterranean world. Apparently, Even the afterlife requires exact change. But sometimes burial customs grew even more cautious. In certain ancient communities, people feared individuals who had died under unusual circumstances. Someone who died violently, mysteriously, or during an outbreak of disease might be treated with extra precautions.
Archaeologists have discovered burials where stones were placed on the body or heavy objects pinned the corpse down. The possible reason? To prevent the dead from rising. Now, historians still argue whether these examples represent actual fear of the undead or simply symbolic rituals meant to ensure the deceased stayed properly in place. But the idea itself reveals something fascinating. Even thousands of years ago, humans worried that death might not always be the final step. That maybe, just maybe, the wrong kind of death could create the wrong kind of spirit. You walk deeper into the burial grounds as the sky darkens again toward evening. Wind moves softly through the grass. The graves feel peaceful, but also quietly powerful. Each one represents a person whose family followed careful traditions to make sure their journey beyond life went smoothly. Because if burial rituals work properly, the dead move on. They become ancestors, guardians, memories. But if something goes wrong, the dead might remain restless. And restless spirits weren't the only supernatural worry ancient people had when it came to death. Because sometimes the sky itself seemed to react to events on Earth. The moon might disappear. The sun might darken in the middle of the day. The ground might shake. To modern science, these are natural phenomena. But to ancient observers, they often looked like messages from angry gods. And when something as enormous as the sky suddenly behaved strangely, people believed the universe itself was trying to warn them, which meant storms, eclipses, and earthquakes weren't just natural disasters, they were cosmic announcements. And when the heavens decided to send a message, everyone paid attention. You're standing near the edge of the burial grounds when something unusual begins happening in the sky. At first, it's subtle. The light changes slightly, like someone slowly turning down a dimmer switch on the sun. Birds start behaving strangely, fluttering toward trees earlier than usual. A few villagers nearby pause in their work and look upward with confused expressions. Then the shadows begin stretching in the wrong direction. Within minutes, the daylight fades into an eerie twilight. What you're witnessing is something we now understand perfectly well, a solar eclipse. But to ancient observers, this moment is nothing short of terrifying. Imagine living in a world where the sun suddenly begins disappearing in the middle of the day with no explanation. No astronomy textbooks, no news alerts, just the sky going dark. It's easy to see why many ancient cultures believed eclipses were warnings from angry gods, or signs that cosmic forces were battling overhead. In ancient China, people thought a giant celestial dragon was devouring the sun during eclipses. Historical records describe communities banging drums, clashing metal, and shouting loudly to scare the dragon away. Which, if you think about it, is actually a pretty bold strategy. Ah, yes, the sky monster eating our sun. Let's yell at it. But according to tradition, the noise worked, because eventually, the sun always came back. Mainstream historical fact. Chinese court astronomers were responsible for predicting eclipses as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. Their job was incredibly important, because failing to predict one could be interpreted as losing control over cosmic harmony. There's even a famous legend about two royal astronomers named Shi and Ho, who were supposedly executed for failing to foresee an eclipse. Historians still argue whether that story is literal history or later moral storytelling, but it shows how seriously celestial events were taken. If the sky behaved unpredictably, it suggested something was deeply wrong with the world. Ancient Mesopotamians also treated eclipses as ominous signs.
especially for kings. Their astrologer priests carefully recorded celestial patterns and believed certain eclipses predicted danger for rulers. Here's where things get especially creative. If an eclipse suggested a king might die soon, priests sometimes appointed a temporary substitute king. This unlucky stand-in would sit on the throne briefly while the real king hid safely somewhere else. If disaster struck during that period, well, technically the prophecy had been fulfilled, just not for the original king. You can imagine how popular the substitute king job was. Quirky historical tidbit. In some cases, these temporary rulers were treated with full royal privileges for a few days. Fine food, fancy clothing, comfortable living. Then, after the danger period ended, they were quietly removed, which makes it possibly the shortest and most nerve-wracking promotion in history. Historians debate how often this practice actually occurred versus appearing mainly in texts, but evidence suggests the ritual did happen at least occasionally. Because when people believed the sky itself could predict death, extreme precautions suddenly seemed reasonable. And eclipses weren't the only cosmic events interpreted as warnings. Comets terrified ancient observers as well. Unlike predictable stars, comets appeared suddenly with long glowing tails stretching across the sky. Their arrival often coincided, purely by coincidence, with wars, plagues, or political upheaval. Naturally, people connected the dots. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder described comets as dreadful omens. In 44 BCE, a bright comet appeared shortly after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Many Romans interpreted it as the soul of Caesar ascending to the heavens. Others saw it as a divine signal that Rome's political future was about to change dramatically. Both interpretations felt meaningful in a time of chaos. Meanwhile, storms also carried supernatural significance. Thunder wasn't just weather. It was the voice of powerful gods. In Greece, thunder belonged to Zeus. In Norse mythology, lightning came from Thor's hammer. Across many cultures, violent storms suggested divine anger. If lightning struck near a village, people might perform rituals to calm whatever god had thrown the celestial tantrum. And honestly, if thunder shakes your house at night in a world without electricity or modern science, it probably does feel like someone enormous is stomping around upstairs. Earthquakes brought similar fear. Ancient Greeks sometimes believed the sea god Poseidon caused earthquakes by striking the earth with his trident. Other cultures imagined giant creatures moving beneath the ground, which makes sense in a way because when the earth suddenly moves under your feet, it feels like something enormous must be pushing it. Historians still argue how much ancient people separated natural observation from religious explanation. Many early astronomers actually understood celestial cycles surprisingly well. But even when patterns were recognized, the meaning behind those patterns often remained spiritual. The sky wasn't just mechanics. It was communication. Standing here, as darkness slowly lifts and the sun reappears, you can hear villagers sigh with relief. Birds resume their normal flight. People step cautiously back into the light. The cosmic warning, whatever it meant, has passed. But while the heavens send messages to entire kingdoms, there are smaller, more personal dangers ancient families worry about every day, especially when a new life enters the world. Because newborn children were believed to be particularly vulnerable to unseen forces. Spirits, curses, jealous glances, and parents developed some very strange rituals to keep those tiny humans safe. Back in the village, a small crowd has gathered quietly outside one of the houses. Not in alarm, more in gentle curiosity. Inside, a baby has just been born. You can hear soft voices drifting through the doorway, along with the thin but determined cry of someone who arrived in the world roughly 5 minutes ago and is already making strong opinions known. In the ancient world, birth is both joyful and deeply nerve-wracking. Not just because childbirth itself was dangerous, which it absolutely was, but because newborns were believed to exist in a very fragile state between worlds. They had only just arrived from wherever souls come from, and that meant spirits, curses, or jealous forces might still try to claim them. So families took protection extremely seriously. You step inside the dim house and notice something curious right away. Several small objects have been placed around the sleeping baby. A charm tied to the cradle, a string of beads hanging nearby, a tiny mark drawn gently on the infant's forehead. None of this is random. These are defensive measures. Across many ancient cultures, babies were considered especially vulnerable to the evil eye you heard about earlier. Their innocence, beauty, and the joy they brought could attract envy, even unintentionally. And envy, remember, was believed to carry dangerous power. Mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greece and Rome, families often gave newborns protective amulets soon after birth. These charms were meant to guard the child from curses, illness, and wandering spirits during their earliest months. Roman children sometimes wore small lockets, similar to the bulla mentioned earlier. The logic was simple. If the world contains invisible dangers, the newest member of the family deserves the best possible shield. You notice the mother gently adjusting a small charm above the cradle. It's shaped like a hand again, an early version of the protective symbols people believed could deflect harmful attention. Meanwhile, an older woman in the room quietly mutters a blessing while burning a small bundle of herbs. Herbs appear constantly in ancient protection rituals. Some plants were believed to have natural spiritual properties, capable of cleansing spaces or driving away harmful spirits. Historians still argue whether these beliefs came purely from superstition or partly from practical observation. After all, certain herbs really do repel insects or carry medicinal benefits. But ancient families didn't necessarily separate medicine from magic. If something worked, spiritually or physically, it stayed in the ritual toolkit. Quirky historical detail. In several cultures, parents deliberately made small efforts to make a baby look slightly less perfect. Yes, really. They might place a tiny smudge of dirt on the child's cheek, or dress the baby in simple clothing rather than fancy garments. The idea was to reduce envy. If the baby appeared too perfect, someone's admiration might accidentally trigger the evil eye. So a little harmless imperfection acted like camouflage. It's the ancient parenting version of saying, "Nothing to see here, universe, just a very average baby." And honestly, every parent knows babies rarely stay clean for long anyway, so the strategy probably saved some laundry. Another interesting belief involved names. In certain ancient traditions, families delayed giving a newborn a permanent name for several days or even weeks. During this time, the child might be called by temporary nicknames. One possible reason? Protection. If spirits or supernatural forces didn't know the baby's true name yet, they might have trouble targeting them. Historians debate exactly how widespread this practice was, but name-related protection rituals appear across many cultures. Names were thought to carry deep power. To know someone's true name meant having a certain influence over them, which is why magical spells in ancient texts often emphasize naming the target very precisely. You watch as the baby finally falls asleep, wrapped in soft cloth and surrounded by quiet watchfulness. The adults relax slightly. For now, the child seems safe. But ancient families didn't rely on a single ritual. Protection continued for years. Children wore charms, participated in small blessings, and followed household customs designed to keep them out of supernatural trouble. Some of those customs involved food. And here's where ancient superstition becomes deliciously weird. Because many people believed certain foods or mixtures could cure illness, block curses, or even improve luck. Herbal tonics, strange soups, unusual ingredients mixed together in ways that would make a modern chef blink twice. Some remedies actually worked. Others were probably more about belief than chemistry. But when sickness or misfortune appeared, ancient healers were ready with a surprisingly creative menu of magical treatments. Which means your next stop in this strange tour of superstition isn't a shrine or a burial ground. It's a kitchen, where someone is about to mix together a remedy that might cure a curse, or at least make everyone feel better about trying. Just don't ask too many questions about the ingredients. Trust me on that. The kitchen smells complicated. That's the most polite way to describe it. You step inside and immediately catch a mixture of scents drifting through the air. Crushed herbs, warm broth, something slightly bitter, and a hint of smoke from a small clay stove. A woman is stirring a pot slowly while murmuring under her breath, occasionally dropping in ingredients from small jars arranged along the wall. Some look familiar, others not so much. In the ancient world, medicine and superstition often share the same kitchen. When someone becomes ill, the cause might be a fever, spoiled food, bad air, or perhaps a curse, an evil spirit, or a jealous glance that slipped through your protective charms. Since no one can be entirely sure which explanation is correct, ancient healers tend to cover all possibilities. Herbs for the body, words for the spirit, and sometimes a recipe that handles both. Mainstream historical fact. Ancient medical texts from Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia show that herbal remedies were widely used. Many of these treatments were surprisingly practical. Garlic, honey, willow bark, and various plant extracts appear frequently in ancient prescriptions. Modern science has actually confirmed that some of these ingredients contain real medicinal properties. Honey, for example, works as an antibacterial agent. Willow bark contains compounds related to aspirin. So while ancient doctors didn't have laboratories, they often relied on centuries of observation. But alongside these sensible ingredients, things could get creative. Quirky historical detail. Certain Mesopotamian healing rituals involved mixing herbs with ingredients like clay, beer, or even animal parts, believed to have symbolic power. A healer might grind plants together with a bit of powdered bone or ashes, while reciting a short incantation meant to drive away illness-causing spirits. It's part pharmacy, part spellcasting, and when you're sick in a time without modern hospitals, you probably accept whatever remedy someone confidently hands you. You watch as the woman adds honey into the pot, followed by a pinch of dried leaves. Then she whispers something quietly before stirring 3 times clockwise. 3 again. That number keeps showing up tonight. Historians still argue whether the spoken words in ancient healing rituals were meant to literally influence supernatural forces or simply comfort the patient. Some scholars believe the ritual itself may have helped reduce anxiety, which can sometimes improve recovery. In other words, ancient healers might have been practicing early forms of psychological medicine without realizing it. Of course, not every remedy was so gentle. Certain traditions included extremely strange treatments designed specifically to counter curses. For example, in some ancient texts, people were instructed to eat particular foods to absorb magical harm. The idea was that the curse could transfer from the person into the food, which sounds reassuring until you remember someone then had to eat the food. Imagine your doctor saying, "Good news, we've transferred the curse into this soup. Please finish the bowl." You'd probably ask a few follow-up questions. Still, food carried strong symbolic meaning in ancient cultures. Sharing meals created bonds between people, and offering food to gods or spirits was one of the most common forms of ritual.
So using food to fight illness or misfortune felt logical. Certain ingredients even developed reputations as protective. Garlic, for example, was widely believed to ward off evil influences. The ancient Egyptians gave garlic to workers building the pyramids, partly as nutrition and partly as protection against sickness, which might explain why pyramid construction sites probably smelled extremely memorable. Other plants carried spiritual associations as well. Laurel leaves were linked with prophecy in Greek traditions. Sage and incense were burned to purify spaces. You notice a small bundle of herbs hanging above the stove, slowly drying in the warm air. They look simple enough, but to the people in this house, they represent something powerful, a chance to restore balance, because in ancient belief systems, illness often meant something had become unbalanced, physically, spiritually, or both. The remedy wasn't just about curing symptoms. It was about restoring harmony between the body, the environment, and whatever unseen forces might be involved. Sometimes that harmony came through medicine, sometimes through ritual, and sometimes through pure hope. The woman finishes stirring the pot and pours a small portion into a clay cup. She hands it to a man sitting nearby, who looks a little pale but grateful. He drinks cautiously. Everyone watches. No one is entirely sure whether the herbs, the honey, or the whispered words are doing the real work. But belief itself carries weight. If the patient begins to feel better tomorrow, the remedy will be remembered and repeated. If not, well, perhaps another mixture will be tried. That's the pattern you've been seeing all night. Superstitions grow through trial, memory, and storytelling. A charm that seemed to work once becomes tradition. A remedy that helped someone spreads through the village. And slowly these practices weave themselves into everyday life. Soon, people won't even remember exactly where the ideas started. They'll simply know that certain days feel luckier than others, that certain journeys shouldn't begin under the wrong signs. Because travel in the ancient world is dangerous enough without ignoring omens. And before anyone sets out on a long road, they'll be watching carefully for signals from the universe. Birds, animals, dreams, numbers, anything that might reveal whether the journey ahead will go smoothly or end in spectacular bad luck. Morning arrives again, pale sunlight stretching across the village roads. But today the atmosphere feels slightly different. Several travelers are preparing to leave. You see them gathering supplies near the edge of town, water skins, bundles of food, walking staffs worn smooth from previous journeys. One man adjusts the straps on a donkey, while another carefully ties a small charm to his belt. No one simply wakes up and leaves without thinking, because in the ancient world, travel is risky. Roads are rough, maps are vague, weather changes quickly. And of course, there's always the possibility that fate itself might decide your journey isn't meant to happen today, which is why travelers look for signs before setting out. Lots of signs. You watch as one man pauses near the road, waiting quietly for a moment before taking his first step forward. He's listening, not to people, but to the world around him. In many ancient traditions, the beginning of a journey carried enormous symbolic importance. If the first moments looked promising, the rest of the trip was more likely to go well. But if something unlucky happened right away, well, maybe it was better to wait until tomorrow. Mainstream historical fact. Ancient Romans paid close attention to what were called omena, everyday signs believed to predict good or bad fortune. A traveler might listen for the first words spoken by someone nearby, or watch which direction birds flew overhead. Certain phrases or events were considered lucky beginnings. Others were deeply suspicious. Imagine leaving town and the first thing you hear is someone shouting, "Disaster! Everything's ruined!" you might quietly step back inside and pretend you forgot something. Better safe than cursed. Historians still argue whether these signs were believed absolutely, or whether people used them partly as excuses to delay risky travel when conditions felt uncertain. Because let's be honest, if the weather looks terrible and you'd rather stay home, blaming the birds is a pretty effective argument. You notice another traveler crouching to examine the ground near the road. At first, it looks like he's checking his sandal straps, but then you realize he's studying footprints. In some ancient superstitions, the direction animals moved near a path could predict the outcome of a journey. A rabbit crossing the road one way might be lucky. Crossing the other way might be less encouraging, which probably made rabbits extremely confused about why people kept staring at them. Quirky historical tidbit. In certain Mediterranean traditions, travelers avoided starting trips on particular days of the week considered unlucky. Some days were associated with negative omens from astrology or past historical disasters. So if your planned departure happened to fall on the wrong day, you might postpone everything. The universe, apparently, had a very strong opinion about scheduling. But not all travel rituals involved avoiding bad luck. Some focused on actively inviting good fortune. You see one woman pressing her hand briefly against a small shrine beside the road before walking onward. She whispers a short prayer, possibly asking for safe passage. Shrines and roadside altars were common along ancient routes. Travelers left offerings to local gods or protective spirits, hoping those forces might watch over the journey. It's a comforting thought. Someone invisible walking alongside you through unfamiliar territory. In ancient Greece, travelers often honored Hermes, the messenger god, who also happened to be the protector of roads and boundaries. Roman travelers sometimes prayed to Mercury, the Roman version of Hermes, for similar protection. If your entire trip depended on surviving narrow mountain passes and unpredictable weather, a little divine support probably felt reassuring. You watch as the group finally begins walking away from the village. Slow steps at first, then steady progress down the dusty road. The travelers glance occasionally at the sky, the birds, the surrounding fields, still alert for any last-minute signs that might suggest the journey should be reconsidered. So far, nothing alarming appears. No broken mirrors. No suspicious owls. No chickens refusing breakfast. The road stretches ahead peacefully, and as they disappear into the distance, you start noticing something familiar about all the superstitions you've encountered tonight. They're ancient, thousands of years old in some cases, yet many of them still feel strangely recognizable. People still knock on wood, still avoid certain numbers, still worry about black cats crossing the road, still feel slightly uneasy when breaking mirrors. Historians still argue why superstitions survive so stubbornly, even after science explains the world more clearly. But one explanation is simple. Humans don't just want explanations. We want reassurance. We want little rituals that make uncertainty feel manageable. So even in modern cities filled with technology and knowledge, you might still catch yourself whispering, "Good luck," before an important moment, or stepping carefully around a ladder just in case. Because the ancient voices of superstition never completely disappeared. They simply followed us into the present. And tonight, as the village fades into memory, and the road stretches quietly into darkness, you can almost hear those old beliefs whispering softly across time. Not demanding you believe them, just reminding you they're still here. And now, as the journey winds gently toward its quiet end, the night grows softer. You've wandered through marketplaces filled with omens, houses protected by charms, temples where dreams carried messages from gods. You've watched priests read the sky, families guard newborn children with careful rituals, and travelers hesitate at crossroads while listening for lucky signs. all of it reveals something simple and deeply human. Long ago, people looked at the world and saw mysteries everywhere. The flight of birds, the flicker of candlelight, the strange shapes dreams create while we sleep. Without modern science to explain those mysteries, imagination stepped forward to fill the silence. Superstitions weren't just fears, they were attempts to make sense of uncertainty. Little stories, woven into daily life to answer the question everyone eventually asks. Why do things happen the way they do? And in a way, those ancient storytellers weren't entirely wrong. The universe is still mysterious. We just describe the mystery differently now. But the quiet rituals remain. A lucky charm in a pocket, a whispered wish before an important moment, a small pause when a black cat crosses the road. Tiny echoes of ancient beliefs still walking beside us through modern streets. And that's oddly comforting, because it means the people who lived thousands of years ago weren't so different from you. They worried about the future. They hoped for protection. They searched for signs that tomorrow might be kinder than today. So as the night settles around you and the world grows calm, imagine those old villages resting beneath the same stars. The birds have gone quiet. The lamps have dimmed. And somewhere, someone is drifting into sleep, waiting to see what messages might arrive in their dreams. The journey fades gently here, and the ancient superstitions, like soft whispers carried on the night air, slowly drift away.